The stun baton sparks in the dark. You hear it before you see it. Electricity crackling against metal, a sound that shouldn't belong in a police station but has somehow become part of the architecture here. Then comes the voice, playful and venomous at once, calling you sweetheart, calling you little piggy, promising that good behavior gets rewarded and bad behavior gets corrected. The man holding that baton was a police sergeant once. Badge, uniform, authority that came with institutional backing and community respect. His name is Leland Coyle, and understanding how a small-town cop became one of the most terrifying instruments in Murkoff Corporation's arsenal requires going back to a childhood in Oklahoma where powerlessness carved itself into bone, where violence became the only language that ever made sense, and where a boy learned that the world divided cleanly into those who hurt and those who get hurt. Over the next several hours, we're going to trace Leland Coyle's complete story, from his birth in a sundown town where racial violence was civic policy, through the abuse that shaped his psychology, into military service that taught him killing could be justified, through a law enforcement career that turned badges into weapons, and finally to the Sinyala Facility where Murkoff gave him permission to become everything he'd always been underneath the uniform. By the end, you'll understand how someone transforms from victim to monster without ever really changing, how institutions create protection for the cruelty they claim to oppose, and why Coyle represents the most uncomfortable truth about fascist systems. They don't make people evil. They just give evil people authority and call it order. If you find something in this deep dive that resonates with you, go ahead and drop a comment letting me know what part connected for you, whether it was a specific moment, a pattern you recognized, or just something that made you pause and think, and throw out a topic suggestion for a future video. I'm always looking for the next horror game rabbit hole to fall into, and some of the best video ideas have come straight from you guys. Building this community means interacting with each other in the comments, and honestly, that's my favorite part of all this. So get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's start. Chapter 1. Blackwell, Oklahoma, and the Inheritance of Violence. Leland Coyle was born in 1923 in Blackwell, Oklahoma. The town's population hovered around 8,000 people, small enough that everyone knew everyone's business, but large enough to support the infrastructure that makes a place feel permanent rather than provisional. Blackwell had schools, churches, a main street with storefronts, and the kind of civic pride that small American towns cultivated during that period as proof they mattered in a country that was still figuring out what it wanted to be. But Blackwell was also a sundown town. The term referred to municipalities where Black Americans were legally or practically prohibited from remaining after dark. These weren't informal prejudices or individual racism. They were codified policies, enforced through violence and backed by local law enforcement. Signs at town limits made the rules explicit, and anyone who violated those rules learned quickly that the consequences would be swift and brutal. Growing up in a sundown town meant absorbing certain lessons about how the world worked. Authority defined who counted as fully human. Violence was an acceptable enforcement mechanism when directed at the right targets. Community approval could be earned through participation in collective cruelty, and power came from being on the right side of arbitrary lines that divided people into those who mattered and those who didn't. Coyle's childhood was marked by violence severe enough that later psychological evaluations would identify it as foundational to his personality development. Murkoff's surveillance files explicitly list anecdotal evidence of abuse of animals and sexual assault under his teenage criminal tendencies. While some records remain incomplete, the implication is chilling. These weren't things done to him, but things he was beginning to do to others. What matters is that Coyle discovered the utility of powerlessness during the years when identity forms, specifically the powerlessness of others. He learned that inflicting pain or fear didn't bring punishment. If you were smart, it brought a sense of control. He learned that the world contained people who would hurt you simply because they could, and the only way to ensure safety was to be the one holding the weapon. This kind of childhood trauma creates several possible developmental trajectories. Some victims internalize their powerlessness and spend their lives trying to avoid confrontation or situations where they might be victimized again. Others develop profound empathy, recognizing their own suffering in others and dedicating themselves to preventing similar harm. But some, like Coyle, develop a different response. They decide that power is the only thing that matters, that the world divides into predators and prey, and that the only way to ensure you're never victimized again is to become the victimizer. Coyle also exhibited animal abuse during his childhood. The pattern is common among children who've experienced severe trauma and are developing antisocial personality structures. Hurting something smaller and weaker provides a sense of control that's been absent from their own lives. The animal can't fight back effectively, can't report the abuse, can't do anything except suffer. And that suffering becomes proof that the child has power, that they're no longer helpless. The progression from animal abuse to violence against people is well documented in psychological literature. Hurting animals desensitizes someone to suffering while teaching them that causing pain can be gratifying. It provides practice in overcoming whatever natural empathy might inhibit cruelty. And it establishes a pattern where exerting power over the vulnerable becomes a coping mechanism for feelings of powerlessness in other areas of life. By the time Coyle reached his teenage years, he'd established himself as someone other kids avoided. He wasn't just aggressive. Plenty of boys in small Oklahoma towns got into fights. Coyle was efficient and cruel in ways that signaled something broken underneath. He'd hurt people in ways that went beyond what the conflict required, that suggested he was enjoying the process rather than just trying to win. This behavior should have led to consequences. But Blackwell in the 1930s and 40s wasn't a place where troubled teenagers received psychological intervention or therapeutic support. If you came from the right kind of family and directed your violence at the right targets, you could operate with remarkable freedom. And Coyle found a community that valued exactly what he had to offer. He became involved with the local Ku Klux Klan chapter as a teenager, with surviving surveillance notes stating that his early criminal tendencies were effectively kiboshed once the Klan gave him an outlet for violence. The Klan's presence in Oklahoma during this period was significant and socially acceptable in ways that later generations find difficult to comprehend. Klan membership wasn't a fringe identity. It was a civic organization that prominent businessmen, politicians, and community leaders participated in openly. The organization provided social networking, political influence, and the opportunity to participate in collective violence that was tacitly or explicitly endorsed by law enforcement. For Coyle, the Klan offered something he desperately needed: institutional validation for his worst impulses. The violence he'd been enacting individually could now happen collectively, with community approval and the protection of numbers. The cruelty he'd learned as a survival mechanism in an abusive childhood could be reframed as patriotic duty, as defense of traditional values, as protection of the community from contamination by people who'd been designated as lesser. The psychological function this served was profound. Coyle could maintain a self-image as someone who mattered, who served important purposes, who contributed to something larger than himself, all while indulging the sadistic impulses that had developed from his trauma. The cognitive dissonance that might have troubled someone with intact empathy simply didn't apply. He'd already learned that suffering was natural and that power justified itself. One incident during Coyle's late teens stands out. His first wife died only 6 months into their marriage after falling down the stairs, an event recorded in later files as suspicious but never seriously investigated. The circumstances were suspicious enough that questions were raised, but nothing was ever formally investigated. Coyle's involvement was rumored but never proven, protected by the same social networks that made his clan activities possible. The pattern here is crucial. Coyle learned early that violence could be gotten away with, that the right connections mattered more than evidence, and that authority figures would look the other way when dealing with someone who was technically on their side. This wasn't an aberration in how his community functioned. It was exactly how it was designed to work. To avoid any deeper scrutiny following his wife's suspicious death, Coyle enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. The timing was strategic. World War II was underway, and military service provided a legitimate exit from a situation that might have become complicated if investigators had looked more closely. The Marines accepted him without difficulty. They needed bodies for the Pacific Theater, and a physically capable young man from Oklahoma with no official criminal record was exactly the kind of recruit they wanted. Coyle served in the Pacific during World War II. His military record indicates 3 confirmed enemy kills, which by itself wouldn't be noteworthy. Killing enemy combatants was the explicit purpose of his deployment. But there were also rumors, documented but never officially investigated, that 2 American soldiers in his unit died under suspicious circumstances while Coyle was present. The details are fragmentary. One death was officially attributed to friendly fire during a chaotic engagement. The other was classified as an accident involving equipment malfunction. In both cases, Coyle had been nearby, and in both cases, there were whispers among other unit members that the official explanations didn't match what they'd observed or heard. Military investigators at the time had limited capacity to pursue these questions. Units were constantly moving, engaged in combat operations where death was common and expected, operating in conditions where forensic investigation was nearly impossible. If a death could be explained through combat chaos or accident, there was little institutional incentive to dig deeper, especially when doing so would undermine unit cohesion and morale. For Coyle, military service provided something valuable beyond just escaping investigation back home. It taught him that killing could be not just tolerated but celebrated when it happened in the right context. He received commendations for his confirmed enemy kills. His superiors valued his aggression and his willingness to volunteer for dangerous assignments. The violence that had made him feared in Blackwell made him respected in the Marines. But there was a crucial difference. In combat, violence had clear objectives and limits. You killed enemy soldiers, not civilians. You followed rules of engagement, maintained discipline, operated within a command structure. Coyle functioned adequately within these constraints, but they chafed. He'd grown up in an environment where violence could be applied to whoever you wanted, as long as you had the social power to avoid consequences. Military discipline required channeling that violence more narrowly, and Coyle found the restriction frustrating even as he complied with it. When the war ended, Coyle received an honorable discharge after roughly 2 years in the Pacific, and returned to Oklahoma, now a trained combat veteran accustomed to violence, and stepping back into a community that hadn't changed in his absence. The clan was still operating openly. The same social hierarchies still determined whose suffering mattered, and Coyle slipped back into his old patterns as easily as putting on familiar clothes. He resumed his involvement with the clan, now as a combat veteran whose military service gave him additional credibility and authority within the organization. He participated in the same activities he'd engaged in as a teenager, except now with military training that made him more effective and more dangerous. But Coyle was also thinking strategically about his future. The clan provided community and permission for violence, but it didn't provide income or long-term security. He needed legitimate employment that would allow him to continue exercising power while also building a respectable public identity. In 1947, Leland Coyle joined the Blackwell, Oklahoma police force. The decision was perfect for someone with his psychology and history. Law enforcement offered authority, weapons, legal protection for violence, and a position in the community that commanded respect, regardless of how that position was actually used. A badge transformed what would otherwise be assault into legitimate force. A uniform made intimidation into law enforcement. And the institutional culture of police departments, especially in small towns where oversight was minimal and officers were protected by tight-knit communities, meant that someone like Coyle could operate with remarkable freedom as long as he maintained the appearance of professionalism. From the outside, Officer Leland Coyle looked like exactly the kind of person you'd want wearing a badge. He was physically imposing. He'd served his country in wartime. He was active in community organizations like the Elks Club and the Veterans of Foreign Wars. He attended church, maintained a neat appearance, and spoke with the kind of folksy authority that made people feel safe when he was on their side. The reality underneath that performance was far darker, and understanding what Coyle did with his badge, how he used institutional authority to indulge every sadistic impulse his childhood had cultivated, requires looking closely at his nearly decade-long career in law enforcement and asking the uncomfortable question of why nobody stopped him until Murkoff came calling. That question is where this story gets genuinely disturbing, because the answer isn't that nobody knew what Coyle was doing. The answer is that the people who knew either approved, looked the other way, or were powerless to intervene against someone protected by the same institutional structures he was abusing. Keep that tension in mind. We're about to enter over a decade of systematic cruelty performed under color of law, where every escalation was documented but never punished, where complaints piled up without consequences, and where a small-town police department became a protection racket for a man who'd learned that authority was just another word for permission. Chapter 2. Nearly a decade behind the badge. Coyle's first years as a police officer were careful. He understood that new hires faced scrutiny, that building trust within the department mattered, and that establishing a reputation as reliable and professional would create latitude for behavior that might otherwise attract unwanted attention. He showed up, on time, completed paperwork correctly, volunteered for undesirable shifts, and presented himself as exactly the kind of officer the department wanted: committed, physically capable, and unquestioning of authority. But even during this probationary period, patterns emerged. Coyle volunteered disproportionately for calls involving violence or potential for confrontation, domestic disturbances, bar fights, arrests of individuals with histories of resistance. These were the assignments he sought out, while other officers tried to avoid them. His official justification was that he had military experience and training that made him better equipped to handle dangerous situations. The reality was that he sought out opportunities to use force. His arrest reports from this period show a consistent pattern. Suspects he encountered seemed to resist arrest at much higher rates than suspects other officers dealt with. They sustained injuries during apprehension, broken bones, lacerations, concussions that Coyle attributed to their own violent behavior, and they frequently arrived at booking with damage that seemed excessive relative to the charges they were facing. Other officers noticed. Senior members of the department recognized that Coyle's arrests were rougher than necessary, that he seemed to enjoy physical confrontation in ways that suggested problems underneath his professional surface, but these observations didn't lead to discipline or counseling. In Blackwell's police culture, excessive force wasn't viewed as a problem requiring correction. It was seen as aggressive policing, as an officer who didn't let criminals push him around, as someone willing to do the hard work that kept the community safe. This response reinforced everything Coyle had learned in childhood and through his Klan involvement. Authority protected him. Violence was acceptable when directed at the right targets. and his reputation among fellow officers improved precisely because of the brutality that should have ended his career. Coyle rose through the ranks to become a police sergeant. The promotion recognized his seniority and his standing among other officers, who generally viewed him as a good cop, someone who backed up his fellow officers, who didn't hesitate when force was needed, who could be counted on in dangerous situations. The promotion also gave him supervisory authority, meaning he could now shape how junior officers approached their work. One of Coyle's later wives died during this period. The official cause of death was listed as suicide, with some sources implying multiple gunshot wounds to the head in a manner so implausible that later commentators treat it as an obvious cover-up. The circumstances were immediately suspicious. Forensic experts generally agree that multiple gunshots to one's own head are virtually impossible, as the first shot typically causes incapacitation that prevents subsequent shots, but the investigation was perfunctory. Coyle's standing in the department meant that his account of discovering her body was accepted without the kind of scrutiny any other suspect would have faced. Within a few years of that wife's death, members of her family began dying under suspicious or poorly explained circumstances, a pattern later writers and fans point to as further evidence of Coyle's abuse of his position. One supposedly died by suicide, another in an electrical fire that consumed their home. A third was found dead in Chicago, having fled there shortly after her daughter's death, officially dying of natural causes, though the circumstances remained murky. The pattern was obvious to anyone looking. Coyle was systematically eliminating people who might have questioned his involvement in his wife's death, or who posed some other threat to him, but nobody with authority was looking. Coyle had built relationships throughout the department and the broader law enforcement community. He was active in police fraternal organizations, well regarded by superiors, someone who other officers socialized with and considered a friend. Investigating him would have meant breaking ranks, violating the informal codes that held police culture together, and risking social and professional consequences from challenging someone popular and connected. This protection extended beyond the police department. Coyle had cultivated relationships with judges, prosecutors, and other civic leaders. He attended the right churches, joined the right social clubs, maintained visibility in contexts that signaled respectability and community investment. His public persona was that of a dedicated public servant who maybe played things a bit rough, but whose heart was in the right place. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this image while knowing what Coyle actually did wasn't difficult for his community to manage. They simply didn't know or didn't want to know. The people he hurt most visibly were criminals, suspects, individuals who'd already been designated as problems. If they claimed Coyle had beaten them unnecessarily or violated their rights, their complaints were easy to dismiss. Criminals lie to avoid consequences. Everyone knows that. And Coyle's word as an officer carried inherently more weight than accusations from people he'd arrested. Coyle's methods became more elaborate as his confidence grew. He developed favorite techniques, ways of inflicting pain that were difficult to document or that could be explained away as necessary force, pressure points that left minimal visible bruising but caused excruciating pain, joint locks that could be described as control techniques but could also be used to break bones if applied with sufficient force, and increasingly, electricity. Coyle developed a fascination with electrical torture during his time as a police officer. The attraction was partly practical. Electrical shocks left minimal physical evidence compared to beating someone, making them harder to document in ways that might support complaints. But the fascination also seemed to have deeper psychological roots. Coyle would often be observed standing in fields during thunderstorms, watching lightning with an intensity that suggested something beyond simple interest in weather phenomena. This attraction to electricity would become his signature. He began carrying a modified stun baton during arrests and interrogations, a tool that technically wasn't standard police equipment, but that nobody in the department questioned him about. Suspects he interrogated would later describe being shocked repeatedly. The pain used both to extract information and simply to punish them for whatever Coyle decided warranted punishment. The electrical torture served multiple psychological functions for Coyle. It gave him godlike power over his victims, the ability to cause intense suffering with the press of a button, to watch them convulse and scream, to see them beg and know that their begging meant nothing unless he chose to grant mercy. The stun baton also maintained distance in ways that physical beatings didn't. He could inflict pain without touching someone directly, without getting their blood on his uniform, keeping the interaction controlled and clinical even as it crossed into sadism. His record during these years included numerous commendations. He received the Officer of the Year award multiple times. He was given a Policeman's Benevolence Association award for community excellence. These honors recognized his high arrest rates, his willingness to take on dangerous assignments, and his reputation among fellow officers as someone who backed them up and didn't shy away from confrontation. The economic dimension of Coyle's career was equally corrupt. He made enormous profits from exploitation of prison labor, extortion, and civil forfeiture. The prison labor racket involved arrangements with local businesses to lease convict labor at rates far below minimum wage, with Coyle receiving kickbacks for facilitating these arrangements and ensuring a steady supply of incarcerated workers. His extortion schemes targeted businesses operating on the margins of legality, gambling establishments, brothels, unlicensed bars, forcing them to pay regular bribes in exchange for protection from arrest, and civil forfeiture allowed him to seize property from suspects under the pretense that it was connected to criminal activity, keeping much of what he took for himself. These schemes required cooperation from prosecutors and judges who either participated in the corruption or looked the other way. The system was symbiotic. Everyone involved benefited financially, and challenging it would have meant risking one's own position and livelihood. Coyle's position at the center of these networks gave him additional protection, as exposing his crimes would have implicated dozens of other people. By the mid-1950s, Sergeant Leland Coyle had operated corruptly and violently for nearly a decade without facing meaningful consequences. He'd killed multiple people, his wives, their family members, suspects in custody whose deaths were explained away as self-defense or accident. He'd tortured countless others using his stun baton and other methods. He'd stolen from the community he was supposed to serve, and he'd been rewarded with promotions, awards, and social standing. Understanding how someone like Coyle could operate this way for so long requires recognizing that he wasn't an aberration in the system. He was the system working exactly as designed. Police departments in small-town America during this period functioned as instruments of social control that prioritized maintaining existing hierarchies over protecting vulnerable populations. Officers like Coyle were valuable precisely because they were willing to use whatever force was necessary to keep designated problems in line, and their excesses were tolerated or celebrated as evidence of toughness rather than condemned as abuse of authority. But this equilibrium couldn't last indefinitely. Federal law enforcement was beginning to pay attention to local corruption in ways that threatened the protective networks Coyle relied on. Civil rights activism was challenging the racial violence that sundown towns like Blackwell had operated on for decades, and the insulation that had protected corrupt officers was starting to erode as legal standards and public expectations shifted. Coyle's position was becoming precarious, though he might not have recognized it immediately. The same behaviors that had been tolerated for years were starting to attract attention from people who didn't share the local community's investment in looking the other way, and that attention would eventually bring him to the notice of people who weren't interested in prosecuting him, but who saw potential in exactly what made him dangerous. Those people worked for Murkoff Corporation, and they had plans for Sergeant Leland Coyle that would make his 20 years of police brutality look like a rehearsal for something far worse. Chapter 3: The Corporation Takes Notice. Murkoff Corporation's interest in Leland Coyle solidified once Project LATHE was underway, and Dr. Hendrik Joliet Easterman began assembling criteria for identifying individuals who could serve as prime assets. Experimental subjects whose existing psychological profiles made them suitable for weaponization rather than destruction. The first iteration of LATHE had taught Easterman that certain people possessed what he called charisma, not in the conventional sense of personal magnetism, but as a specific constellation of traits that allowed them to dominate environments and bend others to their will. Easterman's research team was systematically reviewing law enforcement personnel files across multiple states, looking for officers whose patterns suggested the right combination of violence, authority, and institutional protection. Coyle's name appeared in multiple databases. Excessive force complaints that had been dismissed, suspicious, deaths connected to him that had never been investigated, financial irregularities that suggested corruption but had never resulted in charges. On paper, Coyle looked like exactly what Project LATHE needed, but Murkoff's vetting process was thorough. They didn't recruit solely based on records. They conducted field surveillance to observe subjects in their natural environments, assessing whether the patterns documented in files reflected genuine personality structures or situational behaviors that might not be stable. The surveillance assignment fell to Clyde Perry, one of Murkoff's field operatives who specialized in recruitment for sensitive programs. Perry was a skilled investigator, former military intelligence, someone who understood how to observe subjects without detection and how to assess psychological profiles under operational conditions. Perry spent weeks in and around Blackwell observing Coyle, long enough to build a composite picture from bar gossip, arrest records, and quiet surveillance. He interviewed bar staff and regular customers at establishments Coyle frequented, learning that the sergeant was popular and well-liked, that he had a reputation as a good cop who looked after the community. He reviewed arrest records in detail, noting the patterns of injury and the consistency of resistance claims that suggested systematic rather than occasional excessive force. And he conducted direct surveillance, watching Coyle during work and personal time. One detail stood out repeatedly in Perry's surveillance reports. Coyle was observed standing in open fields during electrical storms on 5 separate occasions. He would drive to rural areas when weather forecasts indicated lightning activity, park his patrol car, and stand watching the storm with an intensity that Perry described as almost devotional. He didn't seek shelter when lightning struck nearby. He seemed drawn to the danger, to the raw power being displayed, in ways that suggested a fascination, bordering on obsession. Perry also documented Coyle's domestic situation. He'd recently remarried after his third wife's suspicious death. The new wife seemed nervous around him, exhibiting body language that suggested fear rather than affection. Perry observed interactions that included Coyle berating her in public and physically intimidating her during private moments that Perry was able to surveil from a distance. The picture that emerged confirmed what Coyle's official record suggested. He was someone whose violence was fundamental rather than situational, whose authority was used to enable cruelty rather than prevent it, and whose psychology centered on power and domination, to the exclusion of empathy or moral constraint. Perry arranged to approach Coyle directly, using the pretense of bribery as a way to initiate contact without raising immediate suspicion. He called Coyle and suggested they meet at a bar on Route 177, claiming to represent business interests that needed assistance from a cooperative police official. The approach was calibrated to appeal to Coyle's known corruption. He'd taken bribes before and would likely agree to meet someone offering money. Coyle arrived at the bar as scheduled. Perry's first impression, documented in his report to Murkoff, was that Coyle presented as affable and professional. He shook hands firmly, smiled at the right moments, used the kind of easy familiarity that suggested he was comfortable in these situations. But Perry had been trained to look past surface performance, and what he saw underneath troubled him even as it confirmed Coyle's suitability for LATHE. Perry began the conversation by offering a modest bribe for information about certain individuals in Coyle's jurisdiction. The offer was deliberately small, not enough to be worth significant risk, but enough to test whether Coyle would take money from a stranger. Coyle accepted without hesitation, confirming Perry's assessment that his corruption was opportunistic and routine rather than something that required building trust first. Then Perry shifted the conversation, asking questions that were designed to probe Coyle's attitudes toward authority, violence, and the people he policed. He framed these as general curiosity, trying to get a sense of whether Coyle would be reliable for future arrangements. But the real purpose was psychological assessment. Coyle spoke with remarkable frankness about his view of police work. He described suspects in dehumanizing terms, calling them animals that needed to be kept in line through force and fear. He expressed contempt for legal restrictions on police authority, suggesting that officers should be given more freedom to use whatever methods worked rather than being constrained by rules written by people who'd never dealt with real criminals. And he made clear that he viewed his badge as conferring inherent superiority, that wearing the uniform meant he was fundamentally better and more important than the people he arrested. What struck Perry most wasn't the content of these statements. Plenty of officers held similar views, however quietly. What was remarkable was Coyle's complete lack of concern about saying these things to someone he'd just met. He displayed no awareness that his admissions might be dangerous, no instinct to moderate his statements for an audience. This suggested either profound stupidity or a complete confidence that his position made him untouchable. Perry tested that confidence by pushing further. He asked about specific cases where excessive force complaints had been filed against Coyle. Rather than becoming defensive or evasive, Coyle laughed and described the incidents as though they were funny stories rather than allegations of serious misconduct. He seemed to view complaints as validation of his effectiveness rather than warnings that should concern him. Finally, Perry raised the question he'd been building toward. He explained that his employer wasn't just interested in local information. They were conducting research related to advanced interrogation techniques and psychological conditioning, work funded by government agencies that required cooperation from individuals with specific skills and experience. Would Coyle be interested in participating in a training program that might lead to opportunities beyond small-town police work? Coyle's immediate response was suspicion. He asked what kind of training, where it would take place, what the compensation would be. Perry provided carefully vague answers. The research was classified. Participants would receive significant financial compensation, and the work involved skills that law enforcement officers were particularly well suited for. But before the conversation could proceed further, Coyle's demeanor changed. Perry had been carefully reading Coyle's body language throughout the interaction, watching for signs that his cover was failing or that Coyle was becoming suspicious. What he saw in that moment was recognition. Coyle had somehow identified that Perry wasn't what he was claiming to be. What happened next was documented in Perry's report and became legendary within Murkoff's recruitment division. Coyle stood up from the table and suggested they continue the conversation outside, in the parking lot where they'd have more privacy. Perry agreed, recognizing that refusing would confirm Coyle's suspicions. They walked out to the parking lot together. The bar's neon lighting cast uneven shadows. Perry's vehicle was parked near the road. Coyle had positioned his patrol car to block easy exit, and as soon as they were away from potential witnesses, Coyle dropped the friendly facade entirely. He didn't ask questions or demand explanations. He simply attacked. One moment he was standing 3 feet away. The next his fist was connecting with Perry's jaw with the kind of trained violence that came from years of practice. Perry tried to defend himself. He had military combat training and hadn't expected to lose a physical confrontation with a man 20 years older. But Coyle fought with a brutality and efficiency that overwhelmed Perry's technical skills. Within a short span of time, Perry was on the ground with broken fingers, heavy bruising, and internal injuries severe enough that he was urinating blood. Coyle had beaten him with clinical precision, targeting areas that would cause maximum pain and damage without being immediately lethal. And through it all, Coyle had been smiling, not with rage or even apparent satisfaction, just the kind of mild, pleasant expression someone might wear while completing routine paperwork. Coyle searched Perry and found identification that confirmed he wasn't a local businessman, but someone connected to corporate or government interests. He confiscated Perry's weapon, stood over him, and asked one simple question: who was Perry really working for, and what did they actually want? Perry, in considerable pain and recognizing that lying further would likely get him killed, told the truth. He explained that he worked for Murkoff Corporation, that they were recruiting for a government-funded research program, and that Coyle's skills and psychological profile made him a valuable potential candidate. He emphasized that the opportunity was legitimate, that participants received significant benefits, and that refusing wouldn't result in any negative consequences. Murkoff would simply look elsewhere. Coyle listened to this explanation while standing on Perry's hand, grinding his boot heel slowly. When Perry finished talking, Coyle didn't respond immediately. He stood there, apparently thinking, while Perry tried not to scream from the pressure on his crushed fingers. Then Coyle stepped back, returned Perry's weapon, and said he'd think about the offer. He walked back to his patrol car, drove away, and left Perry lying in the parking lot. Perry managed to drive himself to a hospital in a neighboring county, where he received treatment and then immediately reported back to Murkoff. His recommendation, despite the beating he'd received, was that Coyle was perfect for Project LATHE. The violence Perry had experienced firsthand confirmed that Coyle's brutality was genuine and reflexive, that he could transition instantly from false friendliness to calculated cruelty, and that he possessed the kind of dominance that would allow him to control environments through sheer presence. Murkoff's leadership agreed with Perry's assessment, but they also recognized that recruitment would need to be handled differently than Perry's failed approach. Coyle couldn't be approached through deception. He was too suspicious and too prone to violence. When he sensed manipulation, he'd need to be recruited through a situation where the benefits were undeniable and where his alternative options were worse than cooperation. That opportunity came 8 months later, when the corrupt networks protecting Coyle finally began to collapse. Chapter 4: The Collapse and the Offer. Federal investigations into police corruption across Oklahoma eventually intensified, threatening Coyle's position. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had taken interest in civil rights violations and systematic abuse by law enforcement in multiple jurisdictions, including Blackwell. The political climate was shifting. Behaviors that had been tolerated for decades were becoming prosecutable liabilities, and officers who'd operated with impunity were suddenly vulnerable. Coyle had ignored warnings that he should moderate his methods or distance himself from the most obvious corruption. His confidence in his institutional protection remained absolute, even as other officers were quietly destroying records or distancing themselves from activities that might attract federal attention. He continued his extortion schemes, continued using excessive force during arrests, continued operating as though nothing had changed. The break came from an unexpected direction. One of Coyle's fellow officers, someone he'd worked alongside for years, was caught in an unrelated federal investigation and decided to cooperate rather than face charges. As part of his cooperation, he provided detailed testimony about corruption in the Blackwell Police Department, including specific information about Coyle's activities. The testimony was credible, corroborated by records, and impossible for local prosecutors to ignore without risking their own positions. Coyle was suddenly facing potential federal charges for civil rights violations, extortion, and abuse of authority. His department couldn't protect him anymore. The investigation was coming from outside their jurisdiction, and attempting to interfere would only make their own positions more precarious. For the first time in his adult life, Leland Coyle was vulnerable. The authority he'd relied on for years had evaporated. His fellow officers were distancing themselves from him. The community that had celebrated him as a hero cop was quietly beginning to discuss how they'd always known something wasn't right about him, retroactively rewriting their complicity as concern that they'd been powerless to act on. Coyle's lawyer informed him that conviction was virtually certain. The federal government had built an overwhelming case. The best outcome they could realistically hope for was a plea deal that might reduce his sentence from life imprisonment to something shorter. Worst case, he was looking at spending the rest of his life in federal prison, surrounded by the kinds of criminals he'd brutalized during his career. Without the badge that had protected him, this was the psychological state Coyle was in when Murkoff made their formal offer. An attorney appeared representing what was described as a private research organization with connections to federal law enforcement and intelligence agencies. The attorney had somehow obtained access to Coyle despite the restrictions typically placed on suspects in federal custody. The conversation that followed was documented in Murkoff's recruitment files, one of the few records where they kept detailed notes about how they approached a potential prime asset. The attorney began by acknowledging Coyle's situation. The federal charges were serious. Conviction would mean decades in prison, assuming he survived long enough to serve his sentence. Former police officers faced particular dangers from other inmates. His career was over, his reputation was destroyed, and his future consisted of nothing but punishment and degradation. Then the attorney presented an alternative. Murkoff Corporation was conducting research related to psychological conditioning and stress testing, work funded by government agencies concerned with Cold War preparedness. They needed personnel with specific skills, military experience, law enforcement background, the ability to maintain authority in stressful situations. Coyle's profile suggested he'd be well suited for this work. The offer was direct. In exchange for participating in Murkoff's research program for a minimum of 5 years, all federal charges would be dismissed. Coyle's cooperation would be classified under national security provisions, meaning the details couldn't be disclosed publicly. He'd be transported to a secure facility in Arizona, where the research was being conducted, and he'd be compensated at a rate significantly higher than his police salary. Coyle asked the obvious question: how could Murkoff make federal charges disappear? The attorney explained that the corporation had contractual relationships with the Central Intelligence Agency and other agencies conducting classified research. When national security interests were involved, accommodations could be made. Personnel needed for important research could be made available through legal mechanisms that weren't accessible to ordinary defendants. The work itself, the attorney explained, would involve overseeing stress exercises with volunteer participants. Coyle would have authority within his assigned area of the facility. He'd be protected by institutional policies and legal frameworks that shielded research activities from outside scrutiny. Essentially, he'd be doing work similar to what he'd done as a police officer, maintaining order, applying pressure when needed, ensuring compliance, except in a research context rather than a law enforcement one. Coyle asked what would happen if he refused the offer. The attorney's answer was simple: nothing punitive from Murkoff. The offer would be withdrawn, and Coyle would proceed to trial with whatever outcome resulted. This wasn't a threat, the attorney emphasized. It was an opportunity that Murkoff was extending because they believed Coyle could contribute to important research. But opportunities could be declined without consequences beyond losing the opportunity itself. Coyle took 48 hours to consider the offer. During that time, he consulted with his defense attorney, who confirmed that the arrangement was legally possible. Unusual, certainly, but not unprecedented. The attorney couldn't advise whether accepting was wise, as the details of what Murkoff's research entailed weren't clear, but he could confirm that the alternative was certain federal conviction. Coyle accepted. The mechanisms through which Murkoff extracted him from federal custody weren't documented in accessible records. The public record shows only that the charges against Coyle were quietly dismissed due to classified circumstances related to national security. He disappeared from Blackwell without explanation, leaving behind confusion and rumors, but no official accounting of where he'd gone or why the prosecution had collapsed. In truth, Coyle had been transferred to Murkoff's custody and transported to the Sinyala Facility in Arizona. He arrived believing he'd escaped consequences for his crimes, that he'd successfully leveraged his skills into a new position that would allow him to continue operating with authority and protection inside a classified, government-linked program. What he didn't understand yet, what Murkoff hadn't fully explained because the explanation required context he'd gain only through experience, was that he wasn't being recruited to continue being a police officer in a different setting. He was being recruited to serve as an instrument of systematic psychological destruction in the most elaborate mind control program ever conducted on American soil. And the authority he thought he'd retained was actually the very first lever Murkoff would use to break him into something far worse than he'd ever been behind a badge. That transformation from corrupt police sergeant to prime asset of Project LATHE is where Coyle's story becomes genuinely horrifying, because what happened at Sinyala proved that someone like Coyle could always become worse, could always sink to depths lower than what they'd already demonstrated, when given institutional permission and a system designed to reward their worst impulses. But understanding that transformation requires understanding what Project LATHE actually was, what Easterman had been building, and why someone like Coyle represented the program's greatest success and its most catastrophic failure at the same time. Chapter 7. The Symbolism and the Psychology of the Electric Shepherd. The stun baton Coyle wields is more than just a weapon. It's the perfect symbol for his entire psychology and for the institutional evil he represents. Understanding why requires looking at what electricity means as a tool of torture and control. Electricity occupies a unique place in the hierarchy of violence. Unlike physical beating, which requires effort and creates fatigue, electricity allows sustained torture, with minimal physical exertion from the torturer. Unlike weapons that cause permanent visible injury, properly calibrated electrical torture leaves minimal marks while causing extraordinary pain. And unlike chemical or pharmaceutical torture, electrical pain is immediate, controllable, and repeatable without waiting for substances to take effect. These practical advantages made electricity popular among totalitarian regimes and torturers throughout the 20th century. But the appeal goes deeper than utility. Electricity represents a kind of godlike power, the ability to cause suffering with the mere press of a button, to watch someone's body betray them through involuntary convulsions, to demonstrate total control over another person's physical experience while maintaining complete detachment from the suffering you're causing. For Coyle, the stun baton served all these functions. It gave him efficiency. He could hurt dozens of people throughout a shift without the physical fatigue that would come from manual beating. It maintained his control. He could keep people at distance while hurting them, never having to touch them directly or risk physical confrontation. And it provided the psychological gratification of total power, making people dance like puppets through their own pain, their bodies no longer under their own control, but responding entirely to his will. The specific choice of a stun baton is also symbolically rich. Similar to stun batons, these are tools for controlling livestock. By using this tool on human beings, Coyle was making explicit his view of the people he policed, and the reagents he terrorized. They were livestock, animals to be herded, creatures whose suffering was merely instrumental toward achieving desired outcomes. This dehumanization was essential to how Coyle functioned psychologically. Research on perpetrators of atrocity consistently shows that maintaining cruelty requires either viewing victims as fundamentally different from oneself, or cultivating emotional absence that prevents empathy from developing. Coyle did both. He viewed people he hurt as categorically different, criminal animals who deserved whatever happened to them. And he'd cultivated emotional flatness that meant their suffering didn't register as meaningful. His lightning obsession deepens this symbolism further. Lightning represents pure destructive power, violence in its most natural and uncontrollable form, energy that simply is without moral dimension or meaning. Coyle's attraction to it suggests identification with this quality. He wanted to be like lightning, a force of nature rather than a moral agent, someone whose violence was simply what he was rather than what he chose. This psychological pattern appears frequently in perpetrators who commit atrocities while maintaining self-images as not really being personally responsible. They weren't cruel people making cruel choices. They were forces acting according to nature or necessity. Their violence was inevitable rather than chosen. Their victim's suffering was just how reality functioned rather than something they were actively causing. The game's representation of Coyle captures this symbolism clearly. His character design emphasizes his electrical fixation. The stun baton is almost always present, sparking as though it were an extension of his body rather than merely a tool he carries. His dialogue reinforces the dehumanization, calling players little piggies, and treating their terror as amusing rather than meaningful. And his behavior demonstrates the emptiness underneath. He's going through motions he's performed for years, violence as routine as breathing, cruelty without passion or purpose beyond its own exercise. The police station setting adds another symbolic layer. Police are supposed to represent law, order, protection of the vulnerable, and institutional justice. Coyle's presence in this environment represents the corruption of those ideals. He wears the aesthetic of authority. The setting reinforces that he's someone who should be trusted, whose violence is legitimate, whose power is officially sanctioned, but the authority is hollow, used to enable precisely the kinds of abuse it's supposedly meant to prevent. This makes encounters with Coyle psychologically disturbing in ways that go beyond simple fear of being hurt. There's a violation of expectation. The police station should be safe. The authoritative figure should be protective. The institutional setting should mean your rights will be respected. Instead, everything that should provide security becomes a tool of oppression. The cognitive dissonance created by this inversion is part of what makes Coyle so effective as a prime asset and so horrifying as a game antagonist. His use of language reinforces this violation. The diminutive nicknames, sweetheart, little piggy, create false intimacy that makes the violence feel more personal and violating. He's not a distant authority mechanically applying force. He's someone who acts like you have a relationship, who speaks with inappropriate familiarity, who treats terrorizing you as a kind of twisted affection. This pattern is characteristic of certain abusers who need victims to recognize them personally, who can't simply hurt anonymously but require their victims to engage with them as individuals. The cheerfulness is equally disturbing. Coyle doesn't rage or seem driven by anger. He's jovial, playful, treating the hunt through his police station as entertainment rather than serious work. This emotional incongruity creates additional psychological pressure. Victims can't even understand the threat in conventional terms. If he were angry, there'd be logic to his violence. But his cheerfulness suggests the violence is casual, that your suffering means so little to him, it doesn't even register as serious enough to warrant appropriate emotional response. Psychologically, this presentation maps onto narcissistic sadism, violence performed not primarily for the suffering it causes, but for what it demonstrates about the perpetrator's power and freedom. Coyle isn't shocking people because he hates them, or even because the institutional objectives require it. He's shocking them because he can, because doing so proves he occupies a position where causing suffering has no consequences for him, because their pain is evidence of his power. This psychological pattern makes Coyle both more and less than simply evil. He's more because his cruelty is so deeply embedded in his identity that it operates without conscious thought. He's not choosing to be cruel in individual moments. He's simply being himself, and his self is cruelty. He's less because there's no depth underneath the surface. He's not complicated or conflicted. He's just empty, a collection of violent patterns running automatically without any meaningful internal life. The game's choice to make Coyle one of the primary antagonists serves important thematic functions. He represents institutional authority, corrupted into oppression. He embodies the danger of giving violent people badges and calling their cruelty law enforcement. He demonstrates how systems protect perpetrators rather than victims when perpetrators serve institutional interests. And he shows what happens when someone builds their entire identity around domination. They become hollow, defined entirely by the power they exert over others, ceasing to exist as coherent individuals. For players experiencing the Outlast Trials, Coyle creates a specific kind of horror. You're not just afraid of being hurt, you're afraid of being hurt by someone who represents perverted authority, whose violence is protected by institutional frameworks, whose cruelty is treated as legitimate duty. The fear isn't just physical, it's social and political. The recognition that power can be used to protect predators, and that the structure supposedly meant to help you might instead be tools of your oppression. This makes Coyle more frightening than monsters or supernatural threats. Those can be clearly identified as dangerous and fought against without moral complexity. But Coyle represents something real, patterns of abuse that exist in actual institutions, police who use badges to enable cruelty, systems that protect perpetrators because addressing their violence would destabilize comfortable hierarchies. He's a horror you can't escape by, leaving the game because versions of what he represents exist in reality. Understanding him requires grappling with uncomfortable truths about how institutional evil functions, how ordinary people become perpetrators, and how systems designed to protect instead become instruments of harm. These aren't pleasant questions, but they're essential questions if we want to recognize when authority is being abused and when protection is becoming oppression. Coyle spent his entire life finding institutions that would protect his cruelty and call it something honorable. Every time one institution could no longer provide that protection, he found another. The clan gave him community, the military gave him training, the police department gave him a badge, and Murkoff gave him permission to become fully what he'd always been underneath all the institutional costumes. That progression is the most disturbing element of his story. He never changed. The only thing that changed was how much violence the institutions protecting him were willing to tolerate and enable. And each escalation was treated as him finally finding the right context for his skills, rather than as progressive revelation of how dangerous he'd always been. Chapter 8: The Decline, the Game, and the Question That Remains. By the time players encounter Coyle in the Outlast Trials, He's been operating at Sinyala since the program's inception in the late 50s. He is experiencing the program's peak operations during LATHE 2, serving as the active threat that welcomes new reagents into the facility during the game's timeline. The Coyle player's face is a man in his mid-30s who has been consumed by his role. He has degraded significantly, his already minimal psychological coherence deteriorating further through the intensity of the experiments. The game presents this through his behavior. He's more erratic than his earlier documented appearances, more obsessive, less capable of the strategic violence that once made him valuable. His patrol patterns in the game show someone going through motions that have lost meaning. He walks routes he's prowled countless times, speaks phrases he's spoken thousands of times, shocks victims with the same stun baton he's used since his Oklahoma police days. But there's a mechanical quality to it now, a sense that he's running on autopilot. His personality so eroded by time and isolation that only the core patterns remain. The game's level design in his police station environment reflects this decay. The space is visibly deteriorating, with peeling paint, malfunctioning equipment, and visual cues that suggest abandonment followed by a rough return to operation. The aesthetic communicates that this isn't a maintained facility but a dying one, kept barely functional, running on institutional momentum rather than active management. Coyle himself shows physical degradation. His appearance in the game presents someone who's aged poorly, his body thickened and worn down in ways that visually suggest years of violence and electrical fixation. But he's still moving, still hunting, still shocking anyone he catches, because that's all he knows how to do. Remove the purpose and he'd simply stop existing. The violence is the only thing keeping him animated. Players experiencing the police station trial must navigate this environment while avoiding Coyle's detection. The gameplay mechanics reinforce his thematic significance. He represents authority that must be evaded rather than confronted, power that players can't fight directly, but can only try to survive through stealth and evasion. This asymmetry mirrors the reality of how vulnerable populations experience abusive authority. You can't fight the police officer beating you, you can only try to survive the encounter, and hope witnesses or documentation might lead to accountability later. The trial objectives force players into morally compromising positions, similar to what historical reagents experienced. You must identify snitches, complete tasks that implicate you in the facility's violence, make choices that protect yourself at others' expense. The game doesn't let you be morally clean. Participation requires complicity, and refusing to participate means failure and the consequences that follow. This design creates cognitive dissonance that serves the game's broader themes. You're not a hero fighting evil. You're a victim trying to survive a system designed to break you, and survival requires becoming complicit in that system's violence. The horror comes not from gore or jump scares, but from recognizing that you're being forced to compromise values you'd like to think you'd maintain, that the situation doesn't offer clean moral choices, and that the people designing the situation understood exactly how to make ordinary people do terrible things. Coyle serves as the enforcement mechanism for this moral destruction. Every time you hesitate, every time you try to resist an objective or help another player instead of focusing on your own survival, he appears. His stun baton delivers consequences for trying to maintain morality in an immoral system. The lesson is brutal and clear. Your compassion will be punished, your resistance will cause suffering, and the only way to survive is accepting that the rules have changed and you must change with them. This creates psychological pressure that mirrors what actual victims of institutional abuse experience. You know objectively that the authority is corrupt, that the violence is wrong, that compliance is morally compromising. But knowledge doesn't protect you when the alternative to compliance is immediate harm. Coyle represents the physical enforcement of this impossible situation, the violence that makes rational calculation favor survival over principle. For players who understand his history, encounters with him carry additional weight. He's not just a gameplay obstacle, he's the culmination of decades of institutional protection for violent men, a living demonstration of what happens when systems value order over justice and when badges become licenses for cruelty rather than commitments to service. The question the game raises through Coyle is the same question his real-world analogs raise. What do you do about people like him? People who've been shaped by trauma into perpetrators, who've found institutional protection for their worst impulses, who've spent years getting away with violence because they served purposes that authority structures valued. Traditional accountability seems inadequate. Prosecuting Coyle for his crimes wouldn't undo the damage he caused. It wouldn't prevent the next person like him from finding institutions willing to protect similar cruelty. It wouldn't address the systemic factors that made his entire career possible. The sundown town that taught him violence was acceptable. The clan that celebrated his racism, the military that tolerated his suspicious behavior, the police department that promoted him despite overwhelming evidence of misconduct, and Murkoff that weaponized him deliberately. Reform seems insufficient. You can't therapy someone like Coyle into becoming a healthy person. His damage is too fundamental, too integrated into his identity. Rehabilitation assumes there's something redeemable underneath the pathology, some core self that could be recovered. But Coyle's core is the pathology. Remove the violence and there's nothing left. Prevention seems like the only real answer, but it requires systemic changes that institutions resist. It means not tolerating the first excessive force complaint instead of waiting until someone's been brutal for 20 years. It means recognizing that badges attract certain personalities and screening more carefully for those who view authority as permission rather than responsibility. It means creating accountability structures strong enough that institutional protection can't shield perpetrators indefinitely. Most fundamentally, it means recognizing that people like Coyle are created through systems, not born as monsters. His childhood abuse, his community's racial violence, his exposure to institutional cruelty, these weren't unfortunate accidents. They were features of how his society functioned. And as long as those features persist, they'll continue producing people whose damage manifests as violence, and whose violence finds institutional homes. The game doesn't provide answers to these questions. It simply forces players to confront them by putting them in proximity to someone who represents all these failures, who embodies the consequences of institutional tolerance for cruelty, who demonstrates what happens when violent men find systems that protect and enable them. Coyle hunts through his decaying police station, stun baton sparking in the dark, calling out to players with his infantilizing nicknames and cheerful threats. He's a ghost haunting an abandoned experiment, kept operational through institutional inertia, serving purposes that may no longer exist beyond simple momentum. And he's a warning about what we create when we value order over justice, when we protect authority rather than challenging it, when we let violent people wear badges and call their cruelty law enforcement. That warning is the real horror Leland Coyle represents. Not that monsters exist, we've always known that, but that we build institutions to protect them, that we reward their violence with promotion and authority, that we look away from overwhelming evidence because addressing it would destabilize comfortable hierarchies. Coyle is frightening, but the systems that made him possible are terrifying, because those systems are real, and they're still operational, and they're still producing people who learn that authority means permission to hurt the vulnerable without consequence. Epilogue: the stun baton goes silent. The lights in the police station are flickering now. They've been doing that for years. Maintenance deferred indefinitely. infrastructure crumbling while operations limp along on borrowed time. Coyle walks his patrol routes through corridors that echo differently than they used to. Emptier somehow, though he couldn't articulate what's changed or why it matters. His stun baton still sparks when he triggers it. The sound is familiar, comforting in the way that only lifetime habits can be. He's been carrying some version of this tool since 1947, over a decade of making it crackle against the dark, using it to write his authority onto other people's bodies. The batteries need replacing more frequently now. The wiring is corroded, but it still works, still delivers the shock that makes people convulse and scream, and remember that he's the one with power. But there are fewer people to shock these days. The reagents come and go, but never in the numbers he remembers from the program's height. The facility itself feels provisional, temporary, like everyone involved knows this can't last, but nobody's decided to officially end it. He's been here through the escalation of the program, through years of walking corridors waiting for the next batch of victims. This feels different, though, like a shutdown is eventually approaching, a permanent one, and ending without even the pretense that operations might someday resume. Coyle doesn't think about endings generally. His psychology has never included much capacity for reflection or planning beyond immediate circumstances, but lately he's been spending more time in the areas that get limited surface access, standing near ventilation shafts, listening for thunder that might indicate storms outside. The lightning obsession has consumed more of his attention as operational demands have decreased. There's less to do, fewer people to hurt, more empty time to fill with standing in the dark, waiting for electricity from the sky. The other prime assets are still operational, though Coyle barely interacts with them. Franco Barbi remains in his manufacturing docks, as empty and methodical as ever. Mother Gooseberry drifts through her orphanage, her fractured personas talking to mannequin children. They're all ghosts at this point, remnants of an experiment that ended years ago, kept animated through institutional inertia, but serving no clear purpose beyond existing. Easterman is still watching. The psychiatrist who recruited and studied them all remains the architect of their nightmare, overseeing lathe operations from behind the glass, recording every degradation for his research. He hasn't faced consequences for what he's doing here. None of them have yet. Murkoff protects itself and its researchers, classifying everything that might be prosecutable, and continuing the work. The reagents who survived carry Sinyala with them. They're scattered across the country now, aging into middle and old age, most having never received acknowledgement of what was done to them. Some killed themselves years ago, unable to integrate the memories or escape the programming. Others have managed approximate normality, building lives that function well enough on the surface while underneath, they're permanently broken in ways only they understand. A few tried to report what happened, finding authorities who either didn't believe them or couldn't act because everything was classified. Their testimony exists in scattered files, dismissed as delusions or exaggerations. The institutional protection that shielded Murkoff during operations continuing to shield them afterward. The corporation still exists, still profitable, still conducting research that probably resembles LATHE in everything except name. And Coyle keeps walking his patrol routes. The stun baton keeps sparking. The police station keeps decaying around him. This is his entire existence now. A man prematurely aged by hate in a uniform that doesn't mean anything anymore, carrying a weapon he doesn't need, haunting an experiment that has consumed him completely. He'll die here eventually, probably in this station, probably alone, probably still holding his stun baton when someone finally finds his body years after it happens. There's a kind of justice in that, though probably not enough. Dying in the place you contaminated with years of cruelty isn't really consequence. It's just geography. The real question isn't what happens to Coyle. It's what happens to the systems that created him. The police departments that still protect brutal officers, that still value arrests and compliance over community trust and rights, the institutions that still recruit people with his psychology, still give them authority and weapons, still tolerate their violence until it becomes too public to ignore, the communities that still look away when vulnerable people report abuse by those in power, still value order over justice, still protect perpetrators, because addressing their crimes would destabilize comfortable hierarchies. Those systems persist. They're still producing people who learn that violence is acceptable when you have the right badge, that authority means permission rather than responsibility, that vulnerable populations exist to be controlled rather than protected. They're still creating Leland Coyles. Maybe not identical, but similar enough. People who discover that their damage can be profitable, that institutions will protect their cruelty, that they can hurt others for years without consequence as long as they serve the right purposes. That's the real horror his story reveals. Not that one man was abused into becoming an abuser, or that he found institutions willing to protect his violence, but that those institutions are still operating, still recruiting, still giving authority to people whose fundamental relationship with power is that it's permission to harm. The systems that made Coyle possible haven't changed enough, and until they do, his story is just a particularly well-documented example of a pattern that repeats constantly in ways we've trained ourselves not to notice. The stun baton sparks one more time in the empty police station. The sound echoes down corridors where nobody's left to hear it, and somewhere in the darkness, Leland Coyle keeps walking, keeps hunting, keeps existing in the only way he knows how, as a weapon that was never properly disarmed, as a warning that was never properly heeded, as a consequence of institutional evil that was never properly addressed. The storm is building outside. Lightning flashes through the ventilation shafts, and Coyle turns his face toward the electricity, drawn to the one thing that's ever made sense to him: pure power without meaning, violence without justification, destruction that simply is. This is where his story ends, but the systems that wrote it are still operational, still creating new chapters, still producing people who will learn that authority protects cruelty and that badges are just another word for permission. Sleep well, the lights are going out, but the stun batons are still sparking somewhere in the dark, held by people who learned everything Leland Coyle could teach them about what authority really means when nobody's watching closely enough to stop it. Chapter 5: Project LATHE and the Discovery of Purpose. Coyle arrived at the Sinyala Facility sometime after its mid-50s construction, transported through the Arizona desert to the sprawling complex that housed Project LATHE. From a distance, the above-ground structures resembled a government research installation or military outpost, functional buildings arranged around central courtyards, perimeter fencing, guard towers, but the real facility existed below ground, in massive corridors and artificial environments built to resemble familiar civilian spaces that had been subtly distorted into psychological weapons. His initial processing was different from what Regents experienced. Coyle wasn't having night vision goggles surgically attached to his skull or being stripped of his identity. He was being oriented as staff, as someone who would work within the system rather than be processed by it. Murkoff personnel explained Project LATHE's official purpose in clinical language, developing psychological conditioning techniques for creating reliable intelligence operatives who could function in high-stress environments without breaking or betraying their programming. Easterman personally conducted Coyle's primary briefing. The psychiatrist was fascinated by Coyle, viewing him as a test case for theories about charismatic personalities and their potential weaponization. He explained that Project LATHE's first iteration had attempted to program individuals who already possessed extreme psychological profiles: criminals, violent offenders, people whose minds were already broken or structured in unusual ways. That iteration had largely failed because subjects with strong existing identities proved resistant to reprogramming or developed their own agendas that conflicted with Murkoff's objectives. The second iteration of LATHE, which was now operational, approached the problem differently. Instead of trying to reprogram extreme individuals, LATHE 2 worked with ordinary people who could be systematically broken and reconstructed according to desired specifications. But this process required catalysts, individuals who could apply the kind of psychological and physical pressure that would break through normal defensive mechanisms. These individuals were called prime assets. They were experimental subjects themselves, but subjects who'd been identified as having psychological profiles that made them useful instruments rather than raw materials requiring processing. Their existing pathologies could be channeled rather than corrected, weaponized rather than treated, directed at reagents in ways that would facilitate the programming LATHE was designed to instill. Easterman saw Coyle as perfect for this role. His law enforcement background provided relevant experience in interrogation, authority, and control. His history of violence demonstrated capacity for sustained cruelty without apparent psychological consequence. His electrical fascination suggested specific interests that could be incorporated into his program design, and his personality structure, the combination of charisma, sadism, and emotional absence, meant he could dominate environments in ways that other prime assets couldn't match. Coyle would eventually be assigned to the police station program, presiding over trials like Snitches Get Stitches. His role would be to maintain order, interrogate reagents, and punish failure or resistance. He'd have access to his preferred tools. Murkoff would provide a modified stun baton far more powerful than the one he'd used during his police career, and he'd operate under institutional protection that made his previous police authority look conditional by comparison. Easterman explained the reagent population, people recruited through false promises or coerced into participation, processed through pharmaceutical conditioning and sensory manipulation, subjected to trials designed to break down their psychological defenses and reconstruct them as programmable agents. Coyle's job was to be one element in this systematic destruction, applying pressure at specific points in the process where authority and violence would catalyze the psychological transformations Easterman's research required. The briefing included touring the facility's other programs. Coyle met Phyllis Futterman, who operated as Mother Gooseberry in an orphanage-themed environment. Her dissociative identity disorder created unpredictable psychological pressure that reagents couldn't defend against through rational strategy. He observed the sleep room, where recorded messages associated with Easterman's programming played on endless loops while drugged. Reagents absorbed phrases that reframed their suffering as necessary work. And he saw the X-Pops, former reagents who'd been broken so thoroughly that they'd become violently insane, now serving as mobile obstacles in trials, living proof of what happened to people who failed LATHE's programs or resisted too effectively. The X-Pops shuffled through corridors with dead eyes and sudden bursts of violence, creatures who'd once been ordinary people before Murkoff destroyed whatever made them human. Coyle's response to all this, documented by observers during his orientation, was notable for its complete lack of shock or moral concern. He asked practical questions about chain of command, about limits on what he could do to reagents, about medical protocols for when subjects sustained serious injuries. He treated the briefing like a job orientation, taking notes about policies and procedures without apparent recognition that he was being inducted into systematic human experimentation that would have been prosecutable as torture and kidnapping if conducted outside classified research parameters. One exchange during orientation became infamous among Murkoff's staff. A junior researcher, new enough to still retain some capacity for ethical discomfort, asked, Coyle whether he had any reservations about the work he'd be doing. Coyle's response was cheerful and matter of fact. He'd spent 20 years hurting people professionally. At least here, he wouldn't have to worry about complaints or oversight committees. The arrangement seemed straightforward to him. Murkoff wanted someone to scare people into compliance, and that was something he knew how to do. Easterman recognized in that moment that Coyle was even more valuable than initial assessments had suggested. Many prime assets required careful management, psychological support to maintain their functionality, rationalization frameworks that allowed them to tolerate what they were doing. Coyle required none of that. He understood what Murkoff wanted and was perfectly willing to provide it without needing elaborate justifications or emotional buffers. Within 2 weeks of arrival, Coyle was operational in his program. The police station environment had been constructed with remarkable attention to detail, booking desks, holding cells, institutional green paint on concrete walls, the aesthetic and architectural elements that made police stations universally recognizable. But the space had been subtly distorted in ways designed to create psychological unease. Fluorescent lighting flickered irregularly. Corridors bent at angles that shouldn't exist in normal architecture. Sounds echoed wrong, creating acoustic confusion that made it difficult to orient yourself or identify where threats were coming from. Reagents entering snitches, get stitches, received objectives that forced them into morally compromising positions. They'd be told to identify a snitch among their group and deliver that person for punishment. The designated snitch was arbitrary, someone randomly selected by the system rather than someone who'd actually betrayed anyone. But the trial's completion required finding this person and bringing them to an electrocution cage where Coyle waited. Coyle's role was to be everywhere and nowhere. He patrolled the police station with his modified stun baton, appearing suddenly when reagents hesitated or tried to resist their objectives. His presence was designed to create constant dread, the knowledge that making wrong choices or showing resistance would result in encountering him, and that encountering him meant pain. The stun baton Murkoff provided was custom designed for psychological impact. It delivered electrical shocks calibrated to be agonizing without causing cardiac arrest or permanent neurological damage. The voltage was high enough to cause involuntary muscle contractions, making victims convulse and lose control of their bodies. The sound of its sparking was distinctive, a crackling buzz that could be heard throughout the police station, announcing Coyle's presence before he was visible. Coyle's approach to his work combined elements from his police career with the new freedom Murkoff's environment provided. He'd learned through his years in law enforcement that fear worked better than constant violence. If you hurt everyone all the time, they adapted or shut down. But if you hurt some people spectacularly while others watched, the observers internalized the lesson without needing to experience the pain directly. At Sinyala, he refined this technique. He'd select reagents who hesitated or showed resistance and make examples of them in ways that other reagents couldn't avoid witnessing. His language during these encounters was distinctive. He called reagents little piggies and sweethearts, terms that combined condescension with menace. The infantilization stripped away whatever adult dignity reagents tried to maintain. The false endearment suggested intimacy that made the violence feel personal rather than procedural. And Coyle's tone remained cheerful throughout, as though shocking someone until they lost control of their bladder was just part of a normal workday, requiring no particular emotional investment. The sexual menace in his behavior was unmistakable. Coyle's violence carried erotic charge for him, not necessarily sexual in the conventional sense, but clearly gratifying in ways that went beyond simple sadism. He'd stand close to victims while shocking them, breathing heavily, occasionally making comments about their bodies or their helplessness that crossed into overtly sexual territory. This dimension of his behavior made encounters with him particularly psychologically damaging, as reagents experienced not just physical pain, but the violation of having their suffering serve as someone's source of pleasure. Easterman's monitoring equipment tracked reagent responses during encounters with Coyle. The data showed remarkable consistency. Reagents who experienced even brief exposure to Coyle demonstrated measurably increased compliance in subsequent trials. They completed objectives faster, asked fewer questions, showed less resistance to morally problematic instructions. Fear of encountering Coyle again overrode other considerations, making him extraordinarily effective as a behavioral conditioning tool. But Easterman also observed patterns that concerned him from a program management perspective. Coyle was exceeding parameters. His violence was sometimes disproportionate to what the situation required. He'd spend extra time with victims, shocking them repeatedly after they'd already demonstrated submission. He'd pursue reagents through the police station environment with theatrical menace that seemed designed more for his own entertainment than for achieving specific research objectives. These excesses created complications. Some reagents became so traumatized by encounters with Coyle that they shut down psychologically, becoming useless for further programming. Others fixated on him specifically, developing psychological profiles where fear of Coyle overwhelmed all other responses. This made them difficult to process through trials that didn't involve him, as their entire mental landscape had been reorganized around avoiding the electric-wielding figure who haunted the police station. Easterman addressed this in a meeting with Coyle 6 months into his operational assignment. The psychiatrist explained that while Coyle's effectiveness was undeniable, he needed to calibrate his violence more precisely. The goal wasn't maximum suffering, it was optimal suffering, the specific amount of pain and fear required to achieve psychological breaking without creating complete collapse. Coyle's response to this feedback demonstrated the core problem with using someone like him as a prime asset. He understood intellectually what Easterman was asking for. He acknowledged that he sometimes got carried away, but he also made clear that restraint didn't come naturally to him. When he had permission to hurt people and was in an environment where they were powerless to stop him, his instinct was to continue until something external forced him to stop. Asking him to self-regulate was asking him to function contrary to his fundamental nature. Easterman tried implementing external controls. Medical monitors were installed throughout the police station that would alert Coyle when a reagent's physiological stress reached dangerous levels. He was instructed to stop when the alert sounded. This worked partially. Coyle would cease shocking someone when alarms indicated cardiac danger, but he'd also developed ways of inflicting suffering that didn't trigger the monitors. Psychological torture through threats and mockery, forcing reagents to perform degrading acts, creating situations where they had to hurt each other to avoid being hurt by him. The other prime assets had mixed reactions to Coyle. Franco Barbi, the prime asset behind the facility's drug manufacturing operations, viewed him with something approaching professional interest. Barbi recognized that Coyle's approach was fundamentally different from his own, where Barbi operated with emotional absence and methodical precision. Coyle was theatrical and excessive, but both achieved similar results, breaking reagents through sustained psychological pressure that made compliance feel like the only rational response. Mother Gooseberry found Coyle disturbing, which was remarkable given her own profound mental illness. Her various personas reacted differently to him. The maternal alter was frightened by his violence. The manic persona tried to engage him playfully, but retreated when he didn't respond to her games. And her darker alters seemed to recognize him as something similar to themselves. She avoided him when possible, staying in her orphanage environment while Coyle remained in his police station. The facility staff who worked with Coyle found him unnerving. He was superficially friendly in non-operational contexts, making small talk in the cafeteria or joking with security personnel. But everyone who interacted with him recognized that the friendliness was performance. Underneath the cheerful exterior was something hollow and predatory. Guards who'd worked in maximum security prisons said Coyle reminded them of certain inmates, people who seemed human until you looked closely and realized something essential was missing. His obsession with electricity intensified during his time at Sinyala. The Arizona desert experienced dramatic thunderstorms, and Coyle was frequently observed standing in open areas during lightning activity. He'd remain exposed even when strikes hit close enough that safety protocols required other personnel to take shelter. Several staff members reported seeing him during storms, with his arms spread wide, head tilted back, apparently trying to get struck. Easterman documented this behavior and theorized it represented a death drive, a psychological attraction to annihilation that coexisted with Coyle's sadism. The psychiatrist speculated that Coyle experienced his own existence as fundamentally empty, that the violence he inflicted on others was an attempt to feel something through their suffering since he couldn't generate authentic feeling internally, and the lightning fascination suggested desire for an ending that would be as powerful and meaningless as the violence he'd spent his life inflicting. This psychological portrait made Coyle simultaneously perfect for Lathe's purposes and fundamentally unsuitable for long-term operational deployment. He could break regions with extraordinary efficiency, but he was too unstable, too driven by impulses he couldn't reliably control, too obviously damaged to function outside the contained environment Murkoff had created for him. He was a tool that worked brilliantly for one specific purpose, but couldn't be adapted for anything else. Coyle became one of the facility's most effective prime assets during his years of operation. He'd processed hundreds of reagents through his program. His presence had become legendary among the reagent population. Those who survived their time at Sinyala carried stories about the electric-wielding policeman who haunted the station, who called you sweetheart while making you convulse, who seemed to enjoy your suffering in ways that made the pain itself secondary to the psychological violation of being used as someone's entertainment. Easterman's research data showed that reagents who'd experienced Coyle's program demonstrated the highest rates of long-term behavioral modification. Years after leaving the facility, when activated through trigger phrases embedded during their conditioning, these subjects performed assigned tasks with minimal resistance. They'd been broken so thoroughly that reconditioning held even when they weren't under active pharmaceutical influence or environmental control. This success vindicated Murkoff's decision to recruit Coyle. From the corporation's perspective, his psychological damage wasn't a liability. It was the very quality that made him valuable. They'd identified someone whose pathology aligned perfectly with their needs, and they'd placed him in a context where that pathology could be expressed without constraint or consequence. But that alignment created a problem that would eventually threaten the entire lathe program. Coyle wasn't just breaking regions, he was becoming increasingly unstable himself, his behavior growing more erratic, his violence less predictable, his electrical obsession consuming more of his attention. The question Easterman faced was whether Coyle could be managed indefinitely or whether he represented a degrading asset that would eventually become more liability than benefit. That question became urgent in 1962 when Coyle's behavior during a trial crossed lines that even Murkoff's ethics-free environment recognized as problematic. The incident would force decisions about prime asset management that would shape the program's final years and ultimately contribute to Lathe's collapse. Chapter 6: The Incident and the Question of Control. During his time at Sinyala, Coyle's violence occasionally exceeded even Murkoff's parameters. Incidents occurred where his brutality threatened reagent survival in ways that complicated the program's objectives. The trial was proceeding normally. The reagents were frightened, showing expected reluctance to betray one of their own, but gradually moving toward compliance as the time pressure and threat of ex-pop encounters pushed them to complete the objective. Coyle was patrolling as usual, his stun baton sparking periodically to remind regents of his presence. The designated snitch, a man in his 40s, who'd been at Sinyala for 6 months and had already been broken significantly by previous programs, was eventually identified and cornered by the other 3 reagents. They were dragging him toward the electrocution cage when Coyle appeared. Standard protocol called for Coyle to allow the reagents to complete the objective themselves, with him serving as overseer and threat rather than active participant. But on this occasion, Coyle intervened directly. He took the snitch from the other reagents and began shocking him repeatedly with the stun baton. Far beyond what the trial parameters required, the man convulsed, screamed, lost control of his bodily functions. Medical monitors immediately began alerting that his cardiac rhythm was becoming dangerously irregular. Staff observing through surveillance equipment issued commands through the facility's intercom system, telling Coyle to stop. He ignored the commands and continued shocking the reagent. Security personnel were dispatched to the police station environment to physically intervene. When they arrived, they found Coyle standing over the unconscious reagent, still holding the stun baton, breathing heavily. The expression on his face was described in incident reports as ecstatic, not angry or satisfied, but experiencing something approaching religious transcendence. The reagent was immediately transported to the facility's medical wing. He'd suffered cardiac arrest but was successfully resuscitated. The physicians who treated him documented severe electrical burns, muscle damage from sustained contractions, and psychological trauma that manifested as catatonic withdrawal. He never fully recovered functionality and was eventually classified as an ex-pop, released into the facility's failed subject population. Easterman convened an emergency review of the incident. The meeting included Murkoff's senior research staff, facility security leadership, and corporate representatives who oversaw LATHE's operations. The question under consideration was whether Coyle had become too unstable to continue serving as a prime asset. Arguments for removing him centered on the pattern of escalating behavior. This wasn't the first time he'd exceeded parameters, and previous warnings had produced only temporary modifications. The incident had nearly killed a reagent, which would have complicated operations by requiring explanations about why someone recruited under false promises had died during what was supposedly stress training. And Coyle's obvious psychological deterioration suggested that continued operation would lead to worse incidents. Arguments for retaining him emphasized his extraordinary effectiveness. No other prime asset achieved comparable results in terms of long-term reagent modification. Replacing him would mean retraining someone else or leaving the police station program without adequate oversight. And from a research perspective, Coyle's escalation was itself interesting. Easterman wanted to document how charismatic personalities degraded under sustained operational stress, and Coyle was providing valuable data. The decision ultimately came from Murkoff's corporate leadership rather than research staff. Coyle would remain operational but under enhanced monitoring. Additional security measures would be implemented. Guards stationed closer to the police station environment, emergency shutdown protocols that could seal sections of the facility if he became uncontrollable, and pharmaceutical options for sedating him if necessary. These measures were implemented immediately. Coyle was informed that future violations of protocol would result in his removal from prime asset status and potential termination of his arrangement with Murkoff. The threat was credible. Coyle had avoided federal prosecution only through Murkoff's intervention, and that protection could be withdrawn if he became more trouble than he was worth. His response to this warning was compliance, but compliance that felt provisional rather than genuine. He acknowledged the new restrictions. He began stopping when medical monitors alerted. He reduced the frequency of his most theatrical violence, but staff who interacted with him noted that the restraint seemed to require enormous effort, that he was constantly on the edge of losing control, that the institutional limits were the only thing preventing him from descending completely into the violence he clearly wanted to commit without constraint. This created a strange dynamic where Coyle was simultaneously Murkoff's most effective prime asset and their most unstable one. He delivered results that validated the entire lathe approach, but he also represented a constant risk, someone who might at any moment cross lines that would force the corporation to eliminate him and deal with the complications that would follow. Easterman became increasingly fascinated by this tension. He began conducting regular psychological evaluations of Coyle, trying to understand what drove his escalation. The sessions revealed that Coyle's obsession with electricity had deepened into something approaching religious fixation. He described lightning as the purest form of power, as violence without moral dimension, as destruction that simply was, without needing justification or meaning. He also spoke during these sessions about his childhood abuse in ways he'd never previously acknowledged. The sessions weren't therapy. Easterman had no interest in helping Coyle heal. They were data collection, mining Coyle's history for insights into how severe trauma shaped the kind of personality that could function as a prime asset. But the content that emerged painted a portrait of someone who'd been fundamentally broken during childhood and had spent his entire adult life trying to transform that breaking into power. The abuse he'd experienced had taught him that the world divided into those who hurt and those who get hurt. His entire life strategy had been ensuring he was always in the first category. His clan involvement, his military service, his police career, his work at Sinyala, all represented variations on the same theme. He surrounded himself with institutional authority that permitted violence, that transformed cruelty into duty, that allowed him to hurt people while maintaining social standing and legal protection. But the strategy was failing. Even at Sinyala, even with Murkoff's protection and explicit permission to brutalize reagents, Coyle was losing control. The violence he'd used to cope with his own powerlessness was consuming him. He couldn't calibrate it anymore, couldn't turn it down, couldn't access whatever internal mechanism normally allows people to stop hurting someone when the objective has been achieved. Easterman documented this degradation with clinical interest. He theorized that Coyle represented a specific failure mode for charismatic personalities. They could dominate environments and influence others, but they lacked internal coherence. Without external structure to contain them, they'd escalate until they either burned out completely or were forcibly stopped. Lathe's programs provided that external structure, but the structure was weakening as Coyle's compulsions intensified. The other prime assets began avoiding Coyle more deliberately. Franco Barbi, who'd previously viewed him with professional interest, started requesting that his own program's schedule not overlap with times when Coyle was operational. He explained to Easterman that Coyle's instability was affecting the facility's overall atmosphere in ways that made other programs less effective. Reagents were fixating on Coyle specifically rather than processing through the broader conditioning Lathe was designed to instill. Mother Gooseberry became actively frightened of him. Her maternal alter would retreat into corners when Coyle was nearby. Her manic persona stopped trying to engage him. And her darker alters, which typically showed no fear of anything, exhibited avoidance behaviors that suggested even her most damaged psychological fragments recognized Coyle as dangerous in ways that transcended normal threat assessment. Facility staff requested transfers away from shifts that involved proximity to the police station. Security personnel expressed concerns that Coyle might eventually turn his violence toward them rather than just reagents. The atmosphere around him was becoming toxic enough that it threatened operational efficiency. Murkoff's leadership began discussing contingency plans. They'd invested significant resources in Coyle, and his effectiveness made him valuable. But assets that threatened the broader program's stability had to be managed carefully. Options under consideration included pharmaceutical intervention to reduce his aggression, transferring him to an isolated program where his behavior couldn't affect other prime assets, or, as a last resort, terminating his employment and dealing with whatever consequences followed. Before any of these contingencies could be implemented, external events overtook internal decision-making. Eventually, Project LATHE faced external pressures that threatened the program's continuation and everything to do with the program's broader sustainability. Federal oversight of classified research was intensifying. Congressional inquiries into MK Ultra were making all psychological conditioning programs vulnerable to exposure, and Murkoff's corporate leadership was beginning to question whether LATHE's potential benefits justified its risks. The decision to wind down the program came from the highest levels of corporate authority. LATHE hadn't failed. Easterman's research had produced valuable data, reagents had been successfully conditioned, and the techniques developed could be applied in future contexts. But the political environment was becoming too dangerous. Better to pause operations, secure the research findings, and wait for circumstances where this kind of work could resume without attracting the attention that might destroy Murkoff entirely. This decision created an immediate problem. What should be done with the prime assets? Coyle, Barbi, Gooseberry, and the others couldn't simply be released into civilian life. They knew too much. They'd committed acts that, however legally protected during program operations, couldn't be easily explained if any of them talked to investigators. And several of them, Coyle especially, posed ongoing dangers to anyone they encountered. The solution Murkoff implemented was elegant in its cruelty. Prime assets would remain at Sinyala indefinitely, maintained in their program environments, living entirely within the fiction of their designated roles. The facility wasn't abandoned, it was fully operational. Staff monitored the site constantly, ensuring that the prime assets performed their functions and that the research data remained secure. Active operations continued without pause, leaving the prime assets to exist in the spaces they used to torment others, trapped in a loop of violence with no end. For Coyle, this meant living in the police station he haunted. The reagents kept coming. The trials continued. The surveillance equipment was always watching. He was never truly alone in corridors that echoed with his own footsteps and the screams of new victims. The psychological impact of this immersion was documented through constant observation by Easterman's staff. Coyle believed the authority was real, that his jurisdiction was legitimate. He maintained his patrol patterns, walked his routes through the police station, and kept his stun baton charged. But as the experiments dragged on, he began deteriorating in ways that were visible, even to the reagents fighting for their lives. He spent increasing time standing in areas where electrical equipment was housed, close to transformers and circuit boxes, apparently seeking proximity to the power he'd used to hurt others. His sleep patterns collapsed. Surveillance showed him wandering at all hours, sometimes talking to himself, sometimes standing motionless for hours in corners where he'd previously cornered regents. The lightning obsession intensified to the point where it dominated his behavior. During storms, he'd go to the few areas of the police station that had limited exposure to the surface, standing as close to the outside as architecture allowed, apparently trying to get as near as possible to the lightning he'd spent years obsessing over. Easterman, who'd left Sinyala when operations ended but maintained interest in the prime assets he'd studied, received reports about Coyle's deterioration with clinical fascination. His theory about charismatic personalities requiring external structure to maintain coherence was being confirmed. Without reagents to dominate, without the operational framework that had given his violence purpose, Coyle was collapsing into the emptiness that had always been at his core. The other prime assets fared differently. Franco Barbi maintained his routines in the Devil's Therapy environment, seemingly unaffected by the absence of victims. His emotional absence meant isolation didn't disturb him. He'd always been hollow, and nothing had changed except the external circumstances. Mother Gooseberry's dissociative disorder meant she experienced the abandonment through her various personas, some of which seemed relieved that the violence had ended, while others grew increasingly distressed. But Coyle had defined himself through domination. His entire identity was built on being the threatening authority, the source of fear, the one who hurt others and was protected in doing so. This state persists every day. Murkoff maintains constant oversight, checking to ensure the prime assets remain effective while leaving them to exist in their artificial environments. The corporation is fully invested in this project, exploring research avenues that embrace LATHE's overt brutality. Then come the events documented in the Outlast Trials game, a new group of reagents appearing at the facility, operations continuing, with brutal parameters and strict oversight. The prime assets, suddenly having purpose again, victims to terrorize, trials to oversee. For Coyle, this represents his psychological reality, living the only role where he's ever functioned, the only context where his damage is deemed valuable rather than simply pathetic. But the ongoing experiments reveal how thoroughly his years of service have damaged him. The Coyle who returned to active operations was more unstable, more obsessive, less capable of the strategic violence that had once made him effective. He'd crossed from being a tool that required careful management into something closer to a force of nature, destructive, unpredictable, and ultimately incompatible with any institutional goal beyond causing suffering. The game's reagents encountered this degraded version of Leland Coyle. The electric-wielding figure who hunted them through the police station was someone who'd spent a lifetime becoming progressively more broken, whose only consistent trait was the stun baton he'd carried since his Oklahoma police days, whose cheerful threats and infantilizing language concealed the absolute void where a personality should have existed. Understanding Coyle's complete arc, from abused child in a sundown town to corrupt cop to prime asset to abandoned monster to the reactivated nightmare players face in the game, reveals something profoundly disturbing about how institutional evil functions. Every organization that shaped him recognized what he was. The Klan saw his violence and welcomed it. The Marines used his aggression and tolerated the suspicions around him. The police department celebrated his brutality and promoted him for it. And Murkoff identified his pathology and weaponized it. At no point did anyone try to stop him or get him help, because at every point he was doing exactly what the institution needed. His damage wasn't a problem to be solved, it was a resource to be exploited. And when he finally became too unstable, even for Murkoff's tolerance, the solution wasn't accountability or treatment, it was abandonment, leaving him to rot in the environment he'd contaminated with years of cruelty. That pattern is the real horror Coyle represents. He's a monster, certainly, but he's a monster that institutions created, protected, and deployed for their own purposes. His existence is an indictment not just of his own choices, but of every system that made those choices possible, profitable, and protected.